one of the most frequently seen signs on the British road network, but for some reason one of the lesser understood signs is that denoting a clearway. So what is a clearway, how did they come about, and what's the potential future for them? The earliest clearways were experiments started in around 1959. They used signs that were rather different to what we're used to today, as you can see. But the fundamental principle of no stopping on the main carriageway was established from the beginning. The reasons for this were quite simple. Back in the late 1950s, traffic flows were increasing dramatically on Britain's roads. Whilst motorways were starting to appear, a number of trunk roads were nowhere near being replaced, so the introduction of clearways was to ensure that the carriageways were free from parked vehicles and other obstructions, and therefore could handle the volumes of traffic that were forming. The earliest clearways tended to be around London, with the A2 and A20 featuring quite predominantly. Later on in the early 1960s, a peak hour clearway was introduced on the A4 out from central London towards Chiswick. And publicity must have been quite impressive because even toys were produced to show the new signs. But there must have been concerns about the legibility of this symbol, because when the War Boys Committee reported in 1963, it had been updated to the familiar red X symbol that we have today. This may also have been because that symbol was being used in mainland Europe, and our obsession with being different from the rest of the continent was seen as counterproductive in the 1960s. How times change. So far though, the sign was great because it was applied to rural roads, where it was realistic to expect that nobody was going to park on the grass verges or anything anyway, so you didn't need to cover those. But huge problems arose when these clearways started to be attached to urban roads. This meant that by 1975, the old peak hour clearway, which nobody had really worked anything out for, was finally addressed, and the new Urban Clearway was introduced. This allowed specific exemptions for vehicles such as taxis to allow passengers to get out. It also allowed vehicles like buses to be able to use bus stops, which technically weren't supposed to be a thing on regular rural clearways. They would always be in a lay-by. By the late 1980s, major roads in London were becoming a serious problem. Plans to drive a network of motorways through the capital had long since collapsed, despite the best efforts of the 1980s Conservative government to resurrect them. It was then decided that, given that new roads were going to be extremely unpalatable in London, that the best thing to do would be to have stricter controls on how roads were used. This led to the formation of what is now known as red routes. These routes are very strict in terms of enforcement. There is no observation period, so if you stop a car on one, you can be penalised instantly. There were several varying degrees of red routes, including red route clearways, which behaved as a standard clearway but also included the verges and central reservations, and then other forms of red route used red lines instead of yellow lines. These also prohibited stopping wherever the red lines were, but some had provisions for parking and other uses such as loading and disabled badge holders. These became a clearer way of signposting the long introduced urban clearways, which had posed no end of problems for drivers who didn't understand the nuances of the pick-up set-down restrictions and the fact that they could exist alongside double yellow lines. But it's worth remembering that these red routes were only allowed to be used in London. So up in Scotland, which by this point had its own powers for authorisations from traffic signs, they went their own way, and in Edinburgh, where bus lanes were introduced that were painted green, they painted double red lines along them and called them, somewhat confusingly, greenways. Back in England, authorities eventually relented and the West Midlands were permitted to start introducing red routes. But it took until the 2016 regulations before you did not need a DFT approval to use them. Obviously none of this includes bus stop clearways, school entrance clearways, and the no stopping in lay-by signs used on major roads. So while we are naughtily stopped here, let me just take this minute to thank people who have supported me on Patreon and Ko-fi. Your names are on the screen now. I really appreciate your support, and if you wish to do the same, there are links on my main channel page. Thank you very much. Let's have a talk about some Clearway fun facts. For example, did you know that the longest continuous clearway in the United Kingdom is on the A9 in Scotland? It starts at Perth and it works its way all the way up to the Black Isle, and it clocks in at 124 miles. The little pair of arrows that used to be placed underneath a clearway sign to tell you were joining a clearway, they're no longer required. They were taken out of the regulations in 2002. powers exist for special event clearways. You often see these for events like the Millennium or the 2012 Olympics. These are installed with agreement from the police and local authorities. The signs are all in the TSRGD, and there are many variations possible. And of course, some signs are well intentioned, but just wrong. But I wouldn't really want to be the person that tries to park there and argue that point. And of course, when I had the authority to do so, signs that were just wrong got taken down. But I do believe that wraps us up on the topic of clearways. I hope you've learned something from this video. If you have, why not give me a like and maybe even a subscribe? I would really appreciate your support. This is the last video I'll be making in 2024. I had considered doing a annual review, but as you may know, 2024 was a terrible year for me and I don't really want to talk about it. So all I'm going to do now is take this opportunity to wish you a happy 2025. I hope that all your goals, dreams, desires, whatever you want to call them, I hope they all come true and you achieve what you want to achieve. I'm going to hopefully have a positive 2025 as well, and I hope to make a lot more videos and get out to a lot more places to see and do things. I will see you on the flip side. Take care of yourselves. All the best. Goodbye.